It's Friday, the 9th of August, and this is the Hot Topics podcast. Welcome to the Hot Topics podcast from NB Medical. Neal Tucker here, and thank you for joining us once again for the latest news, views, and research in general practice. It's the summer. That means generally a bit of a downturn in the research, but we've got lots of interesting things to talk about today. We're going to talk about walking for back pain, what is full-time in general practice, and nasal sprays to prevent the common cold. Now, before we do the news, a bit about what's been going on with NB Medical. Always a bit quieter over the summer. We haven't got any webinars coming up in August, but don't worry, they will be back with a vengeance from the start of September, kicking off with our Hot Topics Pediatrics and Child Health update. That's on Friday the 6th. And then our dermatology for primary care on the 7th. We've got our mental health course the week after that. And then we're into the new season of the Hot Topics course. So we've just finished writing that, putting the book together. We'll be putting the presentations together over the next few weeks. Join us for that on Saturday, the 21st of September. If that's too long to wait, don't worry. If you're craving a bit of CPD over the summer, never fear. All of our webinars are available on demand online through the nbmedical.com website. If you sign up to NB Plus, you get access to all of them for just over £300 a year. Do check it out. Now, on the last podcast, I may have promised an interview with Dr. Katie Bramall-Steiner, who is the current chair of the GPC in England. I'm sure some of you are thinking, hey, Neal, what happened to that then? Well, it did happen. I did even publish it, and quite a lot of you actually managed to listen to it before the BMA themselves actually asked us to take it down. It was out live for a whole 8 hours. As they say, life is one big learning curve. And as we embark on a series of interviews with key figures from the world of general practice, it turns out that I need to liaise with these large organizations' media teams a little bit more. Not something I'm used to having to do for a podcast which I record in my bedroom. Anyway, lesson learned, and we will hopefully have another interview with Dr. Bramall-Steiner in September, which will be very timely because the big news this week is that GP members of the BMA, specifically partners, have voted for collective action to try and improve conditions in their practices. The BMA have suggested a smorgasbord of actions that practices could take to try and put pressure on the government while trying to avoid detrimental effects on patients and staff alike. Will these actions actually have any meaningful impact? Well, the Health Service Journal suggests that they will. So they've estimated a financial cost to the NHS could be around £500 million within the first 4 months of these actions being undertaken. That is a very significant figure and will be a very important lever to be able to pull on during negotiations. Other things in the news. So having pushed for this for years and years in England, Wes Streeting, the new health secretary here, has just walked in and said, okay, we're going to add GPs to the additional roles reimbursement scheme in the face of lots and lots of new trainees qualifying and potentially not having any jobs to go to. £82 million will be ring-fenced specifically for this issue, and the details haven't fully been published yet, but the idea is that it will be recently qualified GPs. Bit of a shame they felt the need to add that caveat. That is a little bit restrictive, but at least it's a step in the right direction. Now, Wes, whilst we've got your attention, can we just have a little chat about the buildings? Because it turns out we've got nowhere to put these extra doctors. And finally, in the news, it would be remiss not to acknowledge that the CQC has been called not fit for purpose. Now, I think we all appreciate the rationale behind having a regulator to ensure standards in healthcare. That seems very reasonable, but it does feel a little bit like things have been slipping recently in the standards of the regulator. I was speaking to a friend recently who actually had to take legal action. Their practice took legal action against the CQC because of a persistently poor rating that they were given, even when they'd addressed all the issues that they'd initially had flagged up. The practice was eventually vindicated, but this shouldn't be necessary. We don't need a regulator that's just doing a witch hunt. What you need is someone that can come in, that can check if there are areas that need to be improved, and then put in a package of support to help that process. Let's hope that the CQC may evolve into an organisation that is more along those lines. Okay, that's enough news. Time to crack on with the research. And I think we'll start with this BJGP paper that's just published online. I don't think it's actually in one of the journals yet. I dare say it may be in their September edition. The title is Trends in Full-Time Working in General Practice. This feels very current as the GPC in England, as part of their collective action measures, are encouraging practices to limit the number of patient contacts each doctor will see in a day to the European Union of General Practitioners recommended maximum, which is 25. I'm sure that all of us are having substantially more patient contacts than that each day, and that's before we've even started on the results, the docman, and the ensuing patient contact that's necessary to action those. The bottom line is, none of us believe that you can do a normal day in general practice to the current BMA standards for what a session constitutes, which is 4 hours and 10 minutes. Does your day, your whole working day, take 8 hours and 20 minutes? I suspect not. That would imply that you've gone to work at 9 o'clock in the morning, left at 5 o'clock in the afternoon, and you've had 40 minutes of break during that time. The reality is that most of us routinely do a much longer working day than that, so possibly 10, 11, 12 hours is not uncommon, and many of you, I'm sure, will be doing even more than that. Or indeed, you're catching up on that work at other times when you're not being paid to actually do it. No wonder then that we've seen a steady shift in working patterns over the last couple of decades, with very few GPs now working a 9-session week. Much more common to see people working perhaps 6 sessions, and that feels like enough. That feels like full time. But this area is a really interesting battleground, and it's highly politicized. How many full-time working GPs are there actually? With governments always wanting to show that they're making more of us, more, even though it feels like there's less and less and less. There's been plenty of recent media coverage as well about the lazy GPs. Only 1 in 4 of them work full-time. If more of them would do more work, the NHS wouldn't be in the state it is. Part of the problem is how you define a full-time GP. And one of the biggest issues here is all that unseen work that all of us are doing every day. So this paper then is attempting to clarify the definition of a full-time working GP, how this has changed over time, and whether these changes are explained by GP demographics. So they pulled data out of surveys for GPs that were conducted between 2010 and 2021, and then compared a number of measures of working time commitments over these time periods, and also measures of workload intensity. The results show over that 11-year period, there has been a reduction in the average number of hours and sessions worked per week, although the drop has not been that large. So average hours went down from 40.5 to 38.0 per week. Average number of sessions has gone down from 7.3 to 6.2 per week. However, the hours per session on average has gone up, so from 5.7 to 6.2. Implying that on average, if we were to work a full day, we're now working 1 hour longer than we did a decade ago. Now, the BMA definition of full-time employment is 9 sessions per week. That's at 4 hours and 10 minutes per session. And of course, we've already addressed the fact that that's nonsense. So it's no surprise using that metric, only 9.5% of GPs are full-time. However, if you use the general UK definition of 35 hours, this is what the UK government use, 65% of GPs are actually working full-time. If you use NHS digital data, which classes 37.5 hours as full-time, then it's 55% of GPs. This data neatly shows that we can stick two fingers up at those negative media reports. The authors also question why there is such variation in the definition of full-time GP. How can you make effective policy decisions before you've clarified this? To quote the paper, the amount of work performed per session is becoming increasingly underestimated. The authors recommend removing number of sessions as a definition for full-time working and instead using hours worked, focusing on that 37.5 hours per week as full-time in alignment with the wider NHS. They also note that that would equate to 6 sessions per week. So if you're working 6 sessions, you're realistically working full-time. If you're working 9 sessions, you're working 1.5 jobs every single week. And they wonder why GPs get burned out. Okay, next we're going to have a think about a Lancet paper, and this is all about walking to help prevent recurrence of back pain. The title is Effectiveness and Cost Effectiveness of an Individualized Progressive Walking and Education Intervention for the Prevention of Low Back Pain Recurrence in Australia, or the Walk Back Trial. The key finding from this trial is that walking for not very long periods, but on a regular basis, is really good at preventing recurrent low back pain. I doubt that many of us would find this finding surprising. The trick, of course, as you and I know, is actually getting people to do it. This study then was a randomized controlled trial recruiting adults from across Australia with non-specific low back pain who weren't already doing some other kind of exercise intervention to try and help it. So they couldn't be doing yoga or Pilates or doing regular exercise. Participants were randomized to one of 2 groups, so a control group where there was just no treatment, or a combined walking and education intervention, which consisted of 6 sessions from a physiotherapist across 6 months. Now, I was almost put off this trial by that very piece of information because that seems like a lot of intervention, but actually the physios were trained up as health coaches. And so rather than giving them physiotherapy, they are actually basically having a chat with them, finding what the barriers to walking might be, how they can overcome those barriers, providing a bit of positive reinforcement, encouraging people to try and integrate a bit of extra walking into their week. And I suspect that many of you may actually have health coaches working in your practice now who could help deliver this intervention. The target was to try and get people walking at least 30 minutes a day, 5 times per week over the course of 6 months. So they initially had those physio appointments heavily loaded within the first 12 weeks to get people going. They had their final follow-up at 6 months, and then they followed up the group for between 12 and 36 months. The primary outcome was the number of days to first recurrence of back pain. It's worth knowing a little bit about the study population. 80% were women, average age was 54. The authors suggest that middle-aged women are more likely than other populations to suffer from low back pain. The average BMI was 30, and the average number of previous episodes of back pain was 30, which seems like a really large number to me. This really was a group that suffered from recurrent low back pain. It was also a group that was really sedentary. On average, they reported walking 60 minutes a week. As someone who spends more time than that, I think, every single day, just chasing the kids around, trying to get them to put their shoes on, that level of inactivity I find absolutely staggering. And perhaps it's no surprise that this group is getting lots of recurrent back pain. The results then, they had 350-ish people in both the intervention and the control group. For the primary outcome, the median days to recurrence of back pain was 100 days longer in the walking group. So it was 112 days on average in the control group, 208 days in the intervention group. Despite the costs of those 6 physiotherapy appointments, they found that the intervention was very cost effective, concluding that this is accessible, scalable, and safe for managing long-term low back pain. What I love about this is the simplicity of the recommendations. And I know in the study they had physios in multiple sessions to cement the behavioural change. But the fundamental message is if you can walk a bit more, the chances are that your back pain is going to be better. And whilst you could rely on physiotherapists or health coaches to provide that reinforcement to encourage people to keep going with the intervention, I think the most useful thing is for the patient to actually feel better, to see and feel that the intervention is working. My dental hygienist has been telling me to floss for years, and I try every now and again, and all it does is make my gums sore. And then last year, she said that I should start using interdental brushes. This seemed like a real pain in the arse to me, but it turns out after using them for a few weeks, my gums and my teeth were amazingly better. I could literally feel the difference. It is a fantastic motivator. That's why I was always unsuccessful with flossing, and it's why I'm now being really successful with these brushes. As an aside, possibly the most exciting thing that's happened to me in 2024, which I admit does reflect poorly on my life, but one of the most exciting things has been interdental brushes. If you've got gaps between your teeth, I heartily encourage you to try them. Before you get concerned, no, there is no paid sponsorship in this podcast. Anyway, I've digressed. Where were we? Oh yeah, if you've got low back pain and you don't move much, walk more. It will change your life. Whilst we're thinking about life changing, how about using a nasal spray to prevent the common cold? This paper published in the Lancet Respiratory a couple of weeks ago. The title is Nasal Sprays and Behavioural Interventions Compared with Usual Care for Acute Respiratory Illness in Primary Care. Now, have you ever walked into a pharmacy and saw this Vicks First Defence spray stuff being hugely advertised all over the place? Are you like me, deeply sceptical, convinced that this is utter BS? Well, this is the study that answers this question. To be clear, this is a well-conducted randomized control trial in UK primary care undertaken by a very experienced primary care research team. Now, before we go down the path of the fact that these nasal sprays are clearly nonsense, it turns out that that's not quite right. There is science behind this. Vicks First Defence is in a group called gel-based nasal sprays, and the idea here is that they can modify the nasal environment. In this context, they're lowering the pH, which means that respiratory viruses may be inactivated, therefore reducing the incidence and or the severity of the illness. This has already been demonstrated in more niche technical scientific studies, but also in actual human-based trials of several hundred people. This study, however, represents the largest and most real-world trial of these treatments. There was actually 4 different arms to this study. So firstly, you had gel-based nasal sprays. Specifically here, they're using Vicks First Defence nasal spray. The second arm was another nasal spray. This was a saline spray, specifically the brand Steronase, which is commercially available. And one of the reasons they use that because it has a pump action delivery mechanism that's identical to that of the gel-based spray. Obviously, they're doing their best to reduce any confounders here. Then there's a third arm, and the third arm was a behavioural intervention. This was a website that patients could access, encouraging physical activity in stress management. The idea being that people who are more physically active, that boost your immune system, and stress can inhibit your immune system. The fourth group was usual care, where they were given brief advice about managing illnesses. The study design then is quite interesting. Initially, I thought the saline spray was essentially like a placebo control to the gel-based spray, but actually we'll come back to the end about why that's not actually correct. Also, I think it's quite interesting to know whether a simple web-based delivered behavioral intervention could be as effective as a active treatment, such as the nasal spray, or better than usual care. I should just say how people were meant to use both of the sprays. The advice was identical for each of them. You use 2 sprays per nostril at the first sign of an infection or after potential exposure to infection. Let's say someone in your family has had an infection, or you've been sat next to someone sneezing on the train, and you do that for up to 6 times a day, either prophylactically or when you start getting symptoms, and then you continue for as long as those symptoms last. They followed patients up for 6 months, and the primary outcome was the total number of days of illness due to self-reported respiratory tract illnesses over that period. This was a big study. There was almost 3,500 patients in each of those 4 groups. The results showed that compared with usual care, both nasal sprays reduced the mean number of days of illness that were reported, from just over 8 in that usual care group to 6.5 with the nasal sprays. This was a statistically significant finding, unlike with the behavioural group, which, although there was a reduction in reported illness days, that failed to reach statistical significance. So quite an interesting positive finding for these nasal sprays. It's not all good news because there were more common adverse events, particularly in the gel-based nasal spray group, with more headache or sinus pain affecting around 8% compared with 5% in the usual care group. The saline spray didn't seem to cause these same issues. The authors concluded then that advice to use either nasal spray reduced illness duration. A secondary outcome measure they explored was antibiotic use with the interventions, and they found that the nasal sprays reduced that by around 1/3 and the behavioural intervention by around 1/4. The authors then concluded that advice to use either nasal spray reduced illness duration, and both sprays and the behavioural intervention could reduce antibiotic use. What seems clear to me is that perhaps I should be less skeptical about these nasal sprays. It also appears from the data that given the very similar efficacy between this gel-based and saline spray, as the latter one has fewer adverse effects, that's probably the one to go for. Is a saline nasal spray anything more than simply placebo? Well, the paper argues that just the process of using it in essentially mechanically washing out the virus might reduce nasopharyngeal viral load, and the less virus that you've got going in, the less likely you are to have a full-blown infection triggered, and also lower viral loads tend to result in lower severity symptoms if an infection does get established. I can see this as a useful tool, something tangible that we can sell up on to patients when they feel they need something to help their illness. And I can also see why it will be an effective tool at further reducing antibiotic, particularly unnecessary antibiotic use. That's a wrap. Thanks for joining us on the podcast today. Have a lovely summer. If you've not been away, I hope you get a holiday. Don't forget, you can always get in touch via email at gphottopix@nbmedical.com and find us on Twitter and Facebook as well. Look after yourselves, everyone. We'll see you next time. Take care. Bye-bye.